All right. Thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm Gretchen Shaw. I'm the Deputy Director here at NCADV, and I'm going to run through just a couple of slides to get us started today. And then I'll be turning the presentation over to our fabulous presenters, Celia Friedman-Levin and Kirsten Rambo. So today's webinar is Immigration Policy Updates and their impact on survivors' paths to protection. Both Cecilia and Kirsten are with Assista. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay, good. That's always a gamble, but welcome today. So I'm sure by now everyone is familiar with Zoom and knows how to manage it well, but if you have a question or you want to share a thought or resource, please do so in the chat box. We'll also be watching the Q&A box. So if you do enter a question there, we certainly will make every effort to answer it throughout the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. We will be sending you a recording of the webinar and a copy of the PowerPoint and any additional resources following the webinar within about 5 days. It takes us a day or two to get everything calibrated and available. Also, we'll be including a link to a downloadable certificate of attendance that you are welcome to use for your own purposes. We'll also, at the end of the webinar, you'll be prompted for a short survey. Please take a minute to fill that out. We certainly appreciate your feedback, and we do lean on that to help improve what we do and consider topics for future webinars. If you're someone who uses Twitter and you want to follow along with today's webinar using the hashtag #AdvoChat, please do so. Oops, I just noticed a typo in that. Yes, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network is also fabulous, but Kirsten and Cecilia, feel free to share your Assista's hashtags and social media links in the chat box. We'll also make sure to include those in the follow-up email. So we apologize for not getting that on the front end. We do have just a couple of questions that we like to ask of participants. So I am going to torture you with just a minute of polls. So tell us where you're located. We like to know if you're either in an urban, suburban, or rural area. And I learned this trick from the last presenter. We're going to end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm going to share the results. So most of you all today are in urban settings, a couple folks in suburban and rural areas. It's always interesting to see how that pans out. All right, so we also are very interested in knowing who is participating today. So if you could please share how you define your role, if you feel comfortable doing so. If you consider yourself an other, please enter that in the chat box and share with everyone. We really appreciate seeing where attendees are located, what you all do for a living. And our funders, as you all probably know, are always very interested in knowing that information as well. So, all right, looks like not everyone shared. So we're going to be ending the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, sharing results. So yeah, not surprising, the majority of folks on the call or on the webinar today are domestic violence or sexual assault advocates, survivors of DVRSA, first responders, wonderful, and others work in government. So yeah, we're thrilled to have everyone today. Okay, so again, Kirsten and Cecilia are our fabulous presenters. The topic again is immigration policy updates and their impact on survivors' paths to protection. So Cecilia Friedman-Levin serves as the policy director for Assista, Immigration Assistance, where she focuses on policy, technical assistance, and training related to immigration remedies for survivors of crime. Before joining Assista in 2012, Cecilia worked as a supervising attorney at Women Empowered Against Violence in Washington, D.C., representing survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in civil and immigration cases. Cecilia also acted as the domestic violence staff attorney at the National Law Center for Homelessness and Poverty, where she worked on federal and local housing protections for survivors of domestic violence. She has also provided legal representation in a variety of defensive and affirmative immigration applications as a staff attorney at IUTA in Washington, D.C. Cecilia was a Fulbright Research Scholar in Santiago, Chile, and she has a BA in International Studies and Women and Gender Studies from American University, and a JD from American University, Washington College of Law. Kirsten Rambo is the Executive Director of ASISTA, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the dignity, rights, and liberty of immigrant survivors of violence. Before moving to California, Kirsten lived in Atlanta, Georgia, where for 6 years she led the National Domestic Violence Prevention Program at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and worked in Africa on special projects in Malawi and Sierra Leone. Kirsten also served as Director of Policy and Programs at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence and as visiting assistant professor at Emory University. She received her PhD in Women's Study from Emory and an MA in English from the University of Georgia. So absolute rock stars today. So thank you both again for being here. I will turn the presentation over to you. I'm going to shut off my camera and mute myself, but I will be here in the background. So if you need anything, let me know.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for NCADV for hosting us today. We're delighted to be with you. Again, I'm Cecilia Friedman-Levin, a policy director with ASISTA. I'm joined by our amazing executive director, Kirsten Rambo. Before we get started, I want to kind of give you the very brief elevator kind of pitch of ASISTA and who we are and what we do. And so if we can go to the next slide. The way that I've always described ASISTA is a small but mighty organization. We are a nonprofit that works with advocates and attorneys nationwide who are serving immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And so the mission, we've been around for, nearly 2 decades now. And our mission is to advance the dignity, rights, and liberty of survivors. And we do that in a variety of ways. We do that by providing individual case assistance and resources. So attorneys and advocates who can reach out to us if they have questions about strategies to help individual survivors who are applying for immigration benefits, some of which we'll be discussing today. We conduct trainings like this on issues related to immigration protections, access to benefits, and also different barriers that survivors face in accessing kind of paths to safety and to justice. And the other part of what we do is to kind of engage in liaison efforts with government agencies and with administrative and legislative policy advocacy to make sure that access to these protections are both safeguarded, right, but also enhanced and improved, and that we are constantly kind of making sure that we are creating policies and procedures that best serve survivors. Another aspect of our work is something that we've engaged in a lot lately over the last few years is litigation, federal litigation support. With regard to different immigration matters as they impact survivors, both in the larger scope of immigration advocacy, but also specifically. So that's a little bit about what we do. And if you go to the next slide, this is a little bit where we are. So we're, as ASISTA effectively exists in the cloud. And so we were very well adapted to remote working because we were doing it pre-March of 2020. So Kirsten is in California. I am in the Washington, D.C. area. We have staff in Connecticut and Houston and Phoenix. So I think this kind of shows you that we are all across the country and we work with, again, with advocates and attorneys nationwide. helping them navigate all of the different issues that are involved in access to immigration protections. So if we go to the next slide, here's what we hope you get out of today. We have a very bold agenda, and we really have a lot to talk about. And we really want to learn from you what your experiences have been working with immigrant survivors of violence in your own community. So we're going to talk about kind of general overview of barriers that survivors face. Then we're going to be talking through a few of the immigration benefits that are available to them. We're going to talk about some recent updates in policies and procedures. Things have changed literally by the day in terms of trying to remedy some of the different policies that have impacted and created a chilling effect for survivors to coming forward to access these, not only immigration benefits, but also going to the court or going to your service providers, and all of the different ways in which policies over the last few years have created a chilling effect on survivors' willingness to come forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's been happening this year and what is changing, how is everything shifting, so that you can provide information to the survivors that you're serving. And to round it all off, we're going to take about how all that information and then think about what your role is, both in terms of your service to survivors, but also within your own agencies, and also then within your larger community, right? And how you can get involved in ways that you are making sure that you're kind of working in concert with others to show how survivors might be kind of uniquely or significantly impacted by not only federal immigration policy, but what's happening on your local level. So with that, again, it is a very bold agenda, but we are going to now hand it over to Kirsten to get us started. If we can go to the next slide.
Thank you. Thanks, Cecilia. And thank you again to NCADV for hosting us. We're so happy to be here with you today. I'm Kirsten, and as Cecilia mentioned in this first section, we really are going to talk about barriers. And excuse me, I think that all of you already know a lot about the many kinds of barriers that survivors face when trying to get safe. So we're just going to take a little time here to talk about what those barriers look like for survivors who are immigrants. Really looking to you for some audience participation today. This is going to be a little bit interactive, and I think more enjoyable if we go through it together. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. What we want to do is just run through this hypothetical case here together. So let us look at the case of Sandra. You can look this over and we'll just kind of read through it together just to be sure. So Sandra's from El Salvador. She came to the US in 2015 with her 4-year-old son, and she had left El Salvador because her son's father was physically abusive to both of them, her and the son. She was apprehended at the border. She was given a paper to show up in court, but never received the date and time of when to appear. When she arrived in the US, she met Simon. They fell in love. They had a daughter, Sarah. Simon eventually became physically abusive to Sandra. He forced her to work in his store without pay, and he was physically and sexually assaulting her frequently. There's one incident when he cut her arm with scissors in front of the children, and after that, Sandra left with both of the kids to go to her friend Sophia's house. Sophia, as a good friend, took pictures of the bruises and took Sandra to the hospital for stitches. Sophia also urged Sandra to call the police to take a report, which she did do the following day. Excuse me, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Sandra tries to go to a local domestic violence shelter. That shelter does not have any Spanish-speaking staff and is concerned about whether or not they might get in trouble for harboring an immigrant who's undocumented. At the same time, Sandra's worried about going to get a protection order, a TPO, TRO, at the court because she doesn't know if ICE will be there. Obviously, a big concern for her. So the police arrested Simon for assault, and he has a court date coming up. The prosecutor's asking Sandra to testify, and she's concerned that Simon is going to bring up her immigration status. So let me pause there and see if there are any just overall initial reactions to Sandra's story. What does this make you think of right out the gate before we get into some specifics? You can raise your hand, speak up, put something in the chat. Does anybody have any questions about this hypothetical story?
Right. Or interested too, if you can maybe raise your virtual hand if you've had a client or work with someone like Sandra, who, you know, is concerned about going to the shelters or going to the court. You raise your virtual hand so we can see.
Anita is saying, I had this exact scenario. Andrea is saying, very often, only Spanish-speaking victim advocate in our county. And then there's this question, where can an advocate start to get help for someone like Sandra, right? So these are all right. Language line, a lot of people saying the same thing. So obviously this is a very realistic, very common scenario, right? So if we can go to the next slide, please. You know, one helpful way to think about a case like this is to think about assessing risks, you know, think in terms of assessing risks. So some of you may be familiar with the work of Jill Davies, who has provided this really helpful framework for thinking about risks. So as you can see here, we've got abuser-generated risks, which are those risks. We'll just run through this real briefly. Those are the risks, and it's very intuitive for lots of us. Those are the risks that are posed directly by the particular person who's choosing violence, which in this scenario is Simon, you know, like physical harm, or maybe the abuser is threatening to take the children. Then you've got system-generated risks. And this is where involving systems has the risk to do harm. So we think about risks that come along with involving law enforcement, risks that come along with involving child protective services, risks that may come along with involving court, the legal system, right? There are risks associated with all of those. And we can imagine in the case of an immigrant survivor, particularly someone who's undocumented, the additional systems like ICE that are involved, additional risks like deportation. And then last we have life-generated risks. And these are the big picture risks like poverty, patriarchy, racism, inequality, right? We can think of that list. So when we think about Sandra's case in particular, what are the risks that you see? And what category would you put those in? And again, you can pop it in the chat, you can raise a hand or speak up. Let's just talk about this for a minute. Right, she does have all three, Leah, for sure. Yeah, and what do you, can we name some of those? What are some of the specific risks that we're seeing for Sandra in this case? Fear of deportation for sure, because of the way things happened when she came in. And how would you categorize that fear of deportation risk? In a way, you could see it, yeah, system generated for sure. Fear of losing her children. And life generated. And you could say that fear of deportation, depending on how Simon is interacting, he could be using that as a tool of abuse against her too, which we see all the time, right? With immigrant survivors. So part of what's helpful about this little Venn diagram here is you can see that they overlap. So that fear of deportation may have a little piece of all of those categories. Yeah. And same with fear of losing the children. Are there other risks that you see for Sandra in this scenario? Fear of having nowhere to go with her children, right? What happened when she went to the DV shelter? They got real worried. They got real worried. They didn't have an advocate who could speak with her. And they were concerned they were going to get in trouble or maybe lose funding for harboring someone who's not documented. So their fear about that translates into her fear about, where can I go? Where can I go with my kids and be safe?
Right. And I think that's another interesting part about the concerns that we're having about the system generated risks, is also perhaps coming from, what information do service providers have about providing information or services to undocumented survivors. And so I'm just going to, as an FYI, share this very important advisory from our partners at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, because they have a huge advisory on this very issue of harboring. So I think if this is something that you have seen before in your communities, like having that information and connecting with organizations like ours and with NCADV can kind of get that information to try to mitigate those system generated risks that are caused by service providers.
Yeah, it's so helpful. Thank you. So much of this has to do with system generated risks, right? Because you all working in this field have heard this dreadful question a million times about why doesn't she just leave, or why don't they just leave? That is, we know, so oversimplifying. And I think this model gives us a helpful way to think about these risks and how they interact with each other, and kind of breaking down what we know is a fiction, unfortunately, that when folks reach out for help, it'll just be there and it'll solve everything. There are system generated risks. And part of our role in this field as helpers is to minimize as much of those as we can, right? I like what Leah said about the language barrier is terrifying, because she may not fully understand all that's happening around her. And that's for sure. That's for sure. So there are certainly things that we can do if we're service providers to help mitigate that risk, right? Anything else that jumps out? I mean, there's always the risk of physical harm, just her safety and her safety of her children, that very foundational elemental risk. That's the abuser generated risk, right? But as she calculates what she wants to do, where she wants to go, what resources she has, she's filtering that also through just the threat of violence. That is a very real, very core abuser generated risk. And are there any life generated risks, those big picture ones that we talked about, that come into play here? Cultural norms. Yep. She's away from home and navigating this whole new country. Yep. Having to start over on her own. There's xenophobia, right? There's xenophobia, lots of places that we look in our culture, unfortunately, and some of our systems, particularly in the last few years, have really been riddled with it. And so being in a climate, in a culture that is unfriendly to people who don't speak the language, or people who look different or have different customs, is one of those life xenophobia, and the fear of strangers, fear of the other, is a life-generated risk that is not particular to Sandra, but certainly impacting the way she's moving through this experience. Yeah. Cultural shock and fear of how to navigate the systems, for sure. Yeah. So if we can move on to the next slide. this is a great list. We could surely keep going for a while. As we think broadly about immigrant survivors and risks, this can, be a helpful way of thinking through these nuances, as I said, and these complexities of the varying risks and how they sort of overlap with each other, right? So this is a list here, not necessarily for Sandra, but the kinds of things we can think about when we think about these risks. So we talked a bit about immigration-related coercion, that abusers can be so good at holding that status over you to get you to do what they want you to do, threatening family members, manipulating law enforcement, thinking about the civil legal system. Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? That's not always a simple answer. Victim services, financial resources. We haven't even gotten into housing. That could be and is a whole different webinar. But thinking about that in this context, you clearly come up with how that can be so challenging, right? We talked a lot about these system-generated risks as well. And things that are on our minds and our hearts anyway, right? Like impact of detention on children. So if we go to the next slide here. This again is just can be a really helpful visual. These are some of the things you've already named. Language access. What was the experience in the home country, right? What's the trauma that folks are bringing with them as they come in? Very, very real fear of removal, deportation, family separation, transportation, right? What's it mean to get access to a bus, or in a more rural area, a driver's license, and how easy is that? Economic, again, we could go on for a while. We're going to talk a little more about that later. And then as we discuss the immigration related abuse, where the abuser is holding that over your head. So if we can go to the next slide. I think this will be very familiar to many of you, the good old power and control wheel. And this is a really helpful tool to look at this through the perspective of immigration. So these categories you're familiar with, but if you look at intimidation, for instance, we know that one. And in this lens, it's hiding or destroying important papers, passport, identification cards, maybe destroying the only thing you brought with you from your home country. Using citizenship or residency privilege, right? So I've got status, but I'm not going to let you get status. I could file the papers to help you get status, but I'm not going to do it unless you comply with what I want. So we could go through this whole wheel, right? And see how the overlaying immigration creates these additional risks and barriers. The threats, of course, of deportation using the children, very real and scary, very real and scary risks. So quick poll, if our host can help us do another quick poll here. Have you heard from immigrant survivors that they are afraid to contact the police?
Right. And we can maybe even extend this, the police, or go to court, or to kind of access other services.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to borrow this awesome tool of going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for that. We can end it. All right.
Look at that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 100% of you are saying, yep, we've seen that. We've seen that. It's very telling, right? This is not a small fear, for sure. And incidentally, if we can go to the next slide.
And the next one, Nick.
There we go. We know that 3 out of 4 advocates, this is from a survey that we did a couple of years ago, back in 2019. 3 out of 4 advocates report that immigrant survivors have concerns about going to court related to the abuser or offender, which makes sense in this context, right? And this was a survey of about 600 advocates. So we know that this is a very real concern. And the question is, what's our role? What can we do to help mitigate this and be aware of it? So next slide, please. would love to have a short discussion about how are you approaching these conversations and what strategies have you found to be helpful so far? Having protocols in place. Absolutely. Do you want to say more, Leah, about what kind of protocols? I'm glad to hear you have protocols in place. It's such an essential building block, right? Once you start figuring out what the concerns are, then you can start building those protocols around what do we do? How are we serving immigrant survivors? And we're going to talk a little more about that later in this presentation. We're going to get down to some nitty gritty about what you can do. Anything else that you want to raise up in this time that you found that has been helpful? Yes, Andrea, thank you. Miriam too. Couple people talking about the importance of language access, right? Connecting with someone who understands your language. It's universal, so vital. And then being bicultural as well as bilingual and seeing yourself in that other person. Yes, thank you, Leah. Yes. Game plan on how to address other languages that you may not have on staff. You're never going to have every language on staff, but making good use of the language line, community partners, these are great, great, great ideas. Absolutely. This is where it starts, right? This is where it starts, language access. Awesome. Awesome. Yes, yes. Of course. I'm just looking at the chat. This is great. Yes, packets, written materials in other languages for sure. I think, Andrea, you make a really good point. It's easier when someone who speaks their language can explain it, and when they talk, they know they're being understood. They don't have to guess about that. That's one little piece of stress removed when you know the other person gets it. Yeah, and the materials, packets, think about your website, right? Other places that people can look and know that they're going to be seen and heard and understood. There's so much here, and I love how you all are so on the right track. And we're going to keep talking about this and also going to keep moving so we can cover our bold agenda. Let's go to the next slide. And yes, I see you, Miriam, building relationships with local law enforcement, for sure, for sure. Access to safety and services. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. We've got another quick poll for you here. This is a true or false, quick true or false. Meaningful access to services for individuals with limited English proficiency is required of federal grant recipients, regardless of the individual's immigration status. Give us a quick true or false. What's your guess on that? You may know, or you may be guessing. Sweet. Folks are still voting.
Shall we do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? I'm going to use that forever. That's great.
Great.
Great. All right.
Thank you. And we got some hands raised. This got some hands raised. So if you raised your hand, I think I saw, whoops, I saw Anita with a hand raised. What questions do you have about this before we dig into this? Okay, well, most of you said, we'll as you have questions, pop them in there. Most of you said that this is true. And this is true. This is true. If we can go to the next slide, please. There's this question, what is meaningful access? And basically, in order for access to services to be meaningful, it's necessary to ensure language access. And you all tapped right into that in our last discussion, right? That was the first piece. Language access for individuals with limited English proficiency. I have this, and this is a requirement of our grant. So if we can just go to the next slide, please.
Right. And I think I will say, if I can, just one thing about this
Yeah.
is that, so where this comes from, like where this protection comes from is a Title VI protection, which kind of prohibits that no one should be excluded from participation or benefits or subject to discrimination because of the race, color, or national origin, right? So this is a Title VI protection. And so protections against national origin discrimination has been interpreted by the courts to include LEP individuals. And so that means that there's a legal obligation for organizations that get federal funding to provide meaningful language access. And there's this great website, I'll put it in the chat, it's lep.gov, that talks about those obligations, talks about complaint processes when it's not available. So if this is something that you're not seeing in terms of language access, as all of you have identified, this is a big deal. And so that's why I think our partners at API GBV and also Esperanza United have technical assistance on creating language access plans. And so if this is something that you see as a need in your community, we're happy to connect you to make sure that there is that access.
Thank you so much. The piece around meaningful is so important, right? Because there's a way in which you can say our services are there for everyone, but to really make it meaningful, you have to ensure that language access piece. So thank you for that. Okay, another quick poll. True or false, Sandra has a right to access emergency medical services? Quick poll. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yep, it's true. It's true. Everybody said that's true. And it is true. And this is absolutely vital. So this should go a long way toward addressing those concerns that service providers have. The reality is that absolutely, Sandra has that right. And if we go to the next slide, we can dig into this even a little bit more. Sorry, I think can we jump to the next one real quick? Obligations of service providers. This is helpful for us to know. Many of you are service providers, and we have these obligations of non-discrimination under our federal funding. And this really breaks it down for you here. If you look at that middle box, all individuals are eligible for emergency services necessary for protection of life and safety, regardless of immigration status, right? So that's super clear. And you can see in the box below that what that access to services necessary for life and safety can mean. Short-term shelter or transitional housing, and this is where a lot of the field comes in, right? The domestic violence field. Crisis counseling intervention programs, child and adult protective services, soup kitchens, food banks, medical and public health services necessary for life or safety, all kinds of things. And some of this was captured in a joint letter from 2016 from HUD, DOJ, and HHS, really spelling out that these services are available for people, regardless of immigration status. They're eligible for them. So if we're able to go back that one slide, can we go back a slide? Is that possible? Yep. Last poll in this section. This is almost like a quiz. Sandra is ineligible for emergency shelter and transitional housing. True or false? This is a little bit of a tricky question. Yep. 5 people voting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yep. Yeah, nailed it. It's a little tricky because we said ineligible, but you've got it. She's eligible. She's eligible. And so the challenge for us as service providers is to know that within our organizations, create protocols to bring that to life, create that meaningful access. And as some of you have pointed out in the chat, build bridges with other local service providers, local law enforcement, et cetera, so that there's no question about this. So that as a community, we're not wondering whether this is, where things stand. It's actually very clear. So thank you. Cecilia's putting the link to that letter in the chat, which is a great resource to check out. And if we can jump to the next slide. And then that one, I think I'm gonna hand it back over to Cecilia to get into more.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I think that you've set the stage really well, because it is kind of addressing myriad kind of like needs and that a survivor might be facing in terms of medical assistance, in terms of housing, in terms of, obtaining emergency services, right? Kind of those first kind of round of like, what is an individual's needs after experiencing domestic or sexual violence. And so we're going to kind of shift from that to kind of looking through what might be available in terms of immigration benefits that are available to survivors. And so if we go to the next slide, please. Many of these protections were created in the 1994 Violence Against Women Act and later in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And they were created by a bipartisan majority in Congress in express recognition of exactly what we talked about, how abusers and perpetrators of crime often manipulate or weaponize these other systems against immigrant survivors, and how someone's undocumented immigration status or maybe dependent immigration status is often used as a means to kind of perpetuate power and control in relationships. So these benefits were created by Congress because it recognized that the immigration system has often been kind of weaponized in this way. So VAWA self-petitions were created in the 1994 Violence Against Women Act. It's for victims of domestic violence that have certain relationships to US citizens or legal permanent residents. And legal permanent residents is what we also refer to as green card holders. U and T visas were created in 2000 with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And those are two benefits, we're going to go into a little bit more detail later, that were created with two primary purposes. One is to be a tool for law enforcement to investigate or prosecute crimes that are occurring in their community. And the second goal was to provide protections for individuals who are coming forward. Another benefit that was created that is especially by Congress for children is a special immigrant juvenile status, which is a path to green cards for children who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And then obviously we have asylum, and those are for individuals who are fleeing persecution or who have a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country. And there's been some really wonderful developments in these last few weeks and months about survivors of domestic violence and obtaining asylum when someone has faced domestic violence in their home country and they're coming to the United States to escape that. Access to asylum for survivors of gender-based violence were definitely significantly limited during the last administration. And there's been a lot of effort lately, especially in these last few months, to kind of restore access to asylum. But we're going to focus on the next slide on 3 protections for individuals who have faced victimization in the United States, right? So VAWA self-petitions, these are just a quick overview of the requirements or what an individual would need to show if they were applying for these benefits. So the first one is requires a relationship with an individual who has a certain immigration status. And the thing about immigration status is that we all have one, right? If I'm born in the United States, then my immigration status is a citizen, right? And so everyone has some sort of immigration status. And so it has to be the spouse or a child of a United States citizen or a legal permanent resident. Or it also can be a parent of an adult US citizen's son or daughter. So that last part really kind of envisions elder abuse, where you might have a parent who is being abused by their adult child. That they have suffered battery or extreme cruelty. And so battery, we know as physical violence, right? But extreme cruelty is something that we think about with emotional abuse, psychological abuse. And so those are the things where all of these kind of the immigration power and control wheel that we saw, that's how some of this element comes into play, right? Is that kind of coercive control, that they are an individual with good moral character. And then if this petition is based on marriage, right? So you're not applying as a child or a parent. If you're applying based on being an abused spouse of a citizen or legal permanent resident, then you have to show that that marriage is in good faith. For U visas and T visas, you have to show that you're a victim of a qualifying crime. There's about 25 plus crimes that are listed in the law. For our purposes, it's important to know that it's domestic violence, it's sexual assault, it's abusive sexual contact, it's stalking. That are all crimes that are covered. Felonious assault, that they have suffered harm as the result of that victimization. And that what's critical about this is about having information about the crime, or they were, or they are, or they will be in some future, helpful in the investigation or prosecution of that crime. So if a crime is reported but doesn't necessarily go anywhere, it's not prosecuted, that still could count potentially because it's the investigation. It doesn't necessarily have to be for a case that goes all the way to the end and the person is prosecuted, sentenced. It can be investigation or, so that or is pretty important. That occur in the United States, and that they are eligible for a waiver. There are certain things that might be important to know about a person's immigration history or criminal history that are part of the discussion and factoring in if they might need a waiver. For T visas, that they have to show that they're a victim of trafficking, that they're here in the United States because of that trafficking, and again, that they complied for reasonable requests from the help of investigations or the prosecution of a trafficking, and that would suffer harm if they had to go back. A critical difference between U visas and T visas is that for U visas, and you can raise your virtual hands if you've worked with these before. I think that would be good to know. I didn't need to lower my hand. I know I've worked with them. All right, Haley, awesome. So is knowing for U visas and T visas, one of the big differences here when we're talking about helpfulness, because remember, those two were grouped together with those dual purposes, right, of being a law enforcement tool and providing protection, is that you cannot pass go in a U visa unless you have a signed certification from law enforcement attesting to that helpfulness. That is not a requirement in the T visa context. So again, that certification from a law enforcement agency or from a judge, from a police, from a prosecutor's office is you cannot pass go, you cannot apply without that certification. But the flexibilities about showing helpfulness in the T visa context are a little bit more flexible. If we go to the next slide, please. Something I just want to touch about in trafficking, because we often see that sometimes that there's cases of trafficking that intersect with domestic violence. And so I just want to take a minute here to kind of show about some of the red flags when we're talking about trafficking. Can they come and go as they wish? Do they have their identity documents? Were they recruited for work through kind of false promises? What is their pay like? What are their hours like? And so I think oftentimes when we're thinking about abusive situations, in our intakes, are we asking about what's happening in the work environment? Right. So just as we're kind of thinking about power and control issues in the context of intimate partner violence, what are we seeing in the context of maybe a workplace environment? And again, so these are just some things to think about when we're talking about, so trafficking is defined as both kind of commercial sex work, but also labor trafficking, which can occur in any work environment, right? From restaurant to hotel workers, agriculture. So this is just something to think about when we're thinking through some questions that might be related to trafficking. If you go to the next slide, please. Let's think about Sandra again. Okay. If we're thinking about a VAWA self-petition, right? What are some questions that we might have? Do we know everything that there is to know if she might potentially be eligible for a VAWA self-petition? Or put in the chat, what do you think that she's potentially eligible for? Anything come to mind? What do we know? What do we not know? What do we want more information about? What are we like, All right, Emily says a U visa. How come, Emily? What gives you those facts that she might be eligible for a U? Anything else? All right, so if we're thinking about VAWA, right? Oh, are they married? Exactly. We don't know. We don't know if they're married, right? And what else don't we know about Simon? We don't know something else about Simon. What don't we know about him? What kind of status does Simon have to have if we're doing a VAWA self-petition? Immigration status. We don't know his immigration status, right? But what does Simon need to be? What kind of puts us in that category of VAWA self-petitions? We don't know he's a citizen or anything? A legal permanent resident, a green card holder. So again, these your cylinders are firing. I'm very excited if you couldn't tell. This is great, is that you're kind of thinking through, what don't we know yet? We need to know Simon's immigration status. We need to know, are they married? Right? And if they're not, then maybe that kind of puts us into the U visa category. We see here that she went to the police, she took a report that they want her to testify in the case coming up, right? So that might kind of put us in that category. But also here, we have something that the sentence here, he forced her to work in his store without pay. What flags might that raise for us? What might we want to know more? Labor trafficking, right, Leah? Exactly. So this might be a situation where we have someone who might be eligible for all three, depending on all these questions that we don't know. Potentially, right? I have had a case myself where a person came to the United States on a fiance visa, had a situation very much like this. And we applied for VAWA, but the fact that she was not paid, did not have access to the documents, felt that she could not leave a situation, could potentially put that in another category. So we're going to go to the next slide because Liana raises a very important question. If we can go to the next slide. No, not that one, the next one. Okay, this is really important, especially as advocates. And I think that it's good to kind of have our radar up about these different options. But it's important that you are partnering with people who are experienced in these survivor-based forms of benefits to be able to ask or to answer Liana's question like with accuracy. So when we're talking to survivors, when we're hearing their stories, it's important to say, oh, you're definitely going to be eligible for a VAWA self-petition. Or you know what, because you might have this criminal issue, you have this conviction in your past, then I don't think that's going to put you in the category of U visas. It is important that we are not under or over promising. If we are having discussions with survivors, it might say, you know what, it sounds like you might want to talk to someone to see if there might be potential immigration benefits available. So I think while it's good to have our flags up, to kind of have our ears to the ground and know the requirements of these things, partnering with folks who are practitioners in your area is absolutely critical. because there's the best option for a client depends on how old they are, depends on what family members might also need to be included in their application. Do they have an old deportation order? What type of deportation order? What kind of is in their criminal or immigration history or that we might need to know about? For example, if I'm eligible for a VAWA self-petition, but I have said that I was a US citizen in the past, that can really complicate things, right? So there's all of these different nuances to know about, to answer Leanna's question, to say, if this is trafficking, is this a severe form of trafficking that would be sufficient for me to reach a T visa? And that, I think, is just to partner with people in your communities, connect with us, and we can help you make those connections to other individuals, so we can help answer those questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, when we're talking to our clients about what's going to happen when we go to court, or what's going to happen with immigration or with enforcement related issues, or what happens if I apply and my case is denied, it's really important, I think, to have the information available so we can kind of talk through these issues that our clients are facing. So I want to kind of run through a little bit about what's going on in the policy world so you can have these conversations. Next slide. Okay, so this year, on January 20th, there were several day one executive orders. The first one reversed all of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement priorities. There were 3 memos that were issued in January of 2017 that created overbroad immigration enforcement priorities, such that survivors were often swept up into enforcement actions, right? And so on day one, January 20th of this year, there's an executive order reversing those policies. It also ended a practice that started in 2018 of referring denied VAWA, U, and T visa cases to immigration court if they were denied. Before that, as a matter of policy, denied VAWA, U, and T visa cases were not forwarded to immigration court because of the chilling effect that that would have on individuals coming forward. And so absent kind of like very, very exceptional circumstances, like there was some kind of national security related issues, but generally speaking, they would not. And so that practice ended on January 20th of this year. On February 18th, we had new ICE guidance on enforcement priorities that kind of narrowed down these overbroad kind of category of who was a priority to kind of 3 areas regarding national security, those who have been entered unlawfully but recently, and those who are considered to be a public safety risk. And then I think importantly for our community is that in April of this year that there was new guidance regarding ICE and CBP on enforcement at courthouses, which has kind of very much been an issue in terms of access to services that has been not only raised by advocates, but also prosecutors and judges in terms of the administration of justice, right? And so there's new guidance that were on immigration enforcement actions so as not to unnecessarily impinge upon the core principles of access to justice. So this is some new guidance that came out as April of this year. So next slide, please. Okay, moving to May, that there's new guidance to ICE on prosecutorial discretion. And so, and kind of listed out some factors that ICE could consider if they decide not to exercise an enforcement action against an individual. So that kind of takes a look at their health, takes a look whether or not they are a primary caretaker, talks to whether or not they are a victim of domestic violence or trafficking or another crime. So this is supposed to be a factor for ICE in deciding whether or not to move forward with an enforcement action. June 11th, they recreated a victim engagement and services line, which replaced that really kind of harmful voice office that they created. And so it serves as kind of a comprehensive and victim support system offered by ICE. And then literally Monday, just this Monday, there was new guidance on victim-centered approaches with non-citizens victims of crime. And so this is brand new guidance about the policies and procedures that ICE should take when they are considering enforcement actions against crime victims, including those who have applied for benefits, including those who haven't, and those who are involved in active investigations and prosecutions. So again, a lot, I think, has been done to try to encourage this access that has been eroded over these last few years. Next slide, please. Again, just more information about the victim engagement and services line. So they have reporting information line, they have VINE access, victim support to provide information about U visas and T visas. And I included the phone number and the website. So that is for more information about this victim engagement and services line. Next slide. So all of those issues were related to enforcement. And so now I want to kind of talk about benefit access. So in February of this year, there's an executive order that says you need to identify and remove barriers that have been created. And they talk about the impact of the public charge rule, which we saw have a real chilling effect on individuals applying for benefits for which they were eligible. There was a case that was reported of a survivor not seeking a SANE exam because she was concerned about public charge grounds, which I just think is just, it's terrifying, right? That people are not accessing these services. So there was this executive order about restoring faith in the immigration legal system. And then in the next slide, these are some of the actions you can see that were taken as a result of this. That they stopped denying cases if they had blank spaces on their forms. It expanded how long a person could have a work permit so they didn't have to keep reauthorizing it over and over and over again. And they had a request for information saying, okay, public, tell us what these barriers are, tell us how to address them. And they got about 7,400 comments, which I think speaks to the breadth and volume of barriers that have been created. And so we, if you're interested, as Assista, kind of worked with other DV's SA survivor advocates to identify those. If you're interested in doing a deeper dive, I'd be happy to send it to you. So there are actions kind of taken to kind of say, okay, what are these problems? How do we fix them? And so this is kind of an ongoing process that is kind of that has started as a result of this executive action. Next slide. And again, I think as part of the public charge ground has been dismissed in its entirety. It never applied to victim-based cases like VAWA's, U's, and T's, but I think it just writ large had a chilling effect on immigrant survivors accessing benefits. And so it's good to know now that if you're hearing from clients, I'm concerned about public charge, but this might happen in the future, is to know that it's been dismissed altogether. The next slide. Another new process that has been created is work authorization for pending U visas petitioners. So if we go to the next slide, it's important, I think, to provide an overview of what's happening in the U visa realm because it's a little wild. Here is a chart that shows we talk about U visa principal filings. So a U visa applicant can include family members, certain family members in their applications. So we're not talking about the family members in this chart. We're just talking about the principal victims. The U visa has a cap on 10,000 visas that are available each fiscal year for principals, right? And so this kind of orange line in the middle that you see is a function. It's like it's 10,000 across the board, and that is a function of the fact that they can only issue 10,000 of these visas every year. But what you see in that blue line, and the blue line is the number of cases that they've been getting every year. And you can kind of see that the peak was about 37,000 in 2017. But then you can see just the kind of the chilling effect and those numbers getting lower and lower and lower, and people applying for these benefits. So this big yellow line that you see is that there's 161,000 pending principal applications. And there's only 10,000 available every year. What's supposed to happen is that there's applications are supposed to be, if there's no visa available, then cases are placed on a wait list. And you can get a work permit while you're on your wait list until you're ready to have a visa. But you see here that there's 161,000, there's only 10,000 available every year, which means that if you apply right now, it could be a decade or more before you get a U visa in your hand. And now I'm going to show you another chart that is not going to make you feel better. If we can go to the next slide. If you include family members, you're now looking at 270,000 pending applications, right? And so this means that the efficacy of this protection is lost when you have such a backlog of cases. And right now, they're working on U visa applications that were filed probably in the summer of 2016. So there's about a 5-year wait for them even to open your file to look at this case for placement on the wait list, let alone an actual visa, right? So they created a new process. And this new process we can talk about on the next slide. So when you're on the wait list, that it's basically a full look at your case that says okay, if a visa was available, you could have it, right? Because there's no visa available, then you're going to get this kind of work permit until it's available. So again, processing times are now about 60 months. There's only about 100 to 120 people working a caseload of 270,000 cases. And so again, we talked about the summer in 2016. So this new policy, if we go to the next slide, is designed to get people access to work authorization more quickly. And so this is a policy that was created this June, and it's going to be a process by which they can take a look at it. They will do to see whether or not it's a bona fide case. And if we go to the next slide, here's a little bit more about what that means. That you have everything in the file, right? Do you have everything that you need in your application? Do you pose a national security or public safety risk? And do you merit a positive exercise of discretion? So this means that people on the U visa who are waiting for a U visa could potentially have access to work authorization sooner. But the thing is that this is a brand new process, right? And we don't know kind of how this is going to impact processing times. We don't know, how long this will take. So if people are hearing about this, if you've heard about this, I think it's important to manage expectations, right? Because right now people are still working the summer of 2016. If you filed a case in 2019, this is unlikely to affect you right now, right? Until they can ramp up the resources that they need to make it happen. But it is exciting. They're thinking about ways to reduce the harm that this backlog causes. And so this is a way that if it were resourced, I think would provide a really meaningful difference for survivors who are waiting on their U visas. And I think we can go to the next slide. Right, so these are things we don't know. We don't know how long it's going to take. We don't know how arrests are going to be considered, especially I think this is an issue that we see all the time. If there are that abusers will often kind of call the police on survivors, especially if there's a language access issue, right? So how is that all going to be considered? So these are some outstanding concerns. It's something that we're looking at. We're actually doing a webinar on this process with the Immigration Service next week, not to plug it, but to plug it. And so we should have more information from them soon. All right, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And the next slide. All right, individual systems and advocacy. And Miriam, I agree with you 100%. To increase the number of U visas would require Congress to do that. And so this is something when we're talking about advocacy, is something that it's definitely a problem. And I think the fact that it weakens the goals why they were created. It weakens the ability to be a source of protection, and it weakens the ability to be an effective tool for law enforcement when you have such egregious wait times. All right, and so I'm going to turn it back to Kirsten.
All right, thank you. That's such a great explanation of some of those details that really are so eye-opening for folks, right? So obviously, this all leads us to the question of what can we do? And as advocates and government folks, as many of you are, and survivors, those are questions that I think already come very naturally to you as they do to us. So if we can jump to the next slide, you know, one thing that we can do is, you know, looking at the individual level, we can support survivors in their immigration related cases. And that's what many of us are here to do, right? Connecting them to resources. This is stuff we've talked about. Helping in document collection and other aspects of the application. I think we saw in the beginning that no one on this call in our audience is serving in an attorney role. And that's, you know, there's a role for attorneys, and there's also a role for advocates and other helpers in at least rounding up those documents so that when folks can get connected with an attorney, they're way ahead of the game in terms of what they need. Creating effective language access plan is something that you all jump to very quickly. So true. You've identified it. Maybe you've got one at your organization. Maybe you're still working on it. We shared some resources in the chat to help you kind of move that work forward. Expand your safety planning to take into account what those immigration related risks are for survivors that we dug into a little bit in the beginning here. An example is safeguarding important information. We always talk about that with safety planning, right? Make sure you have your documents and things you need in a safe place. And you can imagine how much even more important that is for survivors where those documents are so critical. So incorporating that into safety planning, adding in know your rights materials into what you're sharing with survivors that you're connecting with at your organization can be so valuable. There's no way that folks would inherently just know what their rights are. So that's a huge role that DV organizations and other service providers can play. Ensure that survivors know that your agency is a safe space, right? And how can you do that? Well, how do we do that? Well, you know, there's lots of ways you can get creative. Think about how welcoming is your website, your printed materials. Someone mentioned earlier, having materials in other languages, having parts of your website translated. All of that suggests we're welcoming, we're here for you. And think about what kind of outreach are you doing to communities that may not be inclined to reach out to you first, right? Ensure institutional awareness about immigration enforcement and confidentiality, making sure that your organization understands what benefits and protections are available to immigrant survivors, just like, you know, we've been running through today. What does confidentiality mean in this context? What are the conditions like in your community? You know, where's law enforcement on all this, and how are they treating immigrant communities where you live? And probably everyone on this call has some sense of what this looks like where you live. You hear, even anecdotally, what that's looking like. Is local law enforcement collaborating really closely with ICE, or are they not? If we can go to the next slide.
One point I would make here, Kirsten.
Yeah, sure.
If you can go back to the last slide just for a second.
Okay.
Is about institutional awareness. Does everyone in your organization know the difference between an ICE warrant and a judicial warrant to enter a place? You know, what is your confidentiality practices if ICE were to call? Right. So I think too, it's kind of what is going on in your community, but it is also kind of a know your rights and confidentiality that you should all be used to as service providers anyway, about these confidentiality protocols of information. But are you confident that if ICE were to show up, people have an understanding of what those protocols, I think as Leah mentioned, what those protocols are, right? what is the difference between an ICE warrant and a judicial warrant? And so we have lots of materials on that in terms of both kind of the immigration safety planning, but also kind of the organizational know your rights components that I think is important to be mindful of as well.
Yes, thank you. That's such a solid example. Next slide. I think, how about a different, let's keep going.
But this one I just wanted to mention, because if we can go back to that one. So this is resources that were created by Violence Free Minnesota. It was created in multiple languages that talked about, about that they were a safe space, that they're not going to report you to immigration, to ICE, to law enforcement. And so it was basically kind of flyers that they created in several different languages. I think there was like 12 to kind of do that outreach that Kirsten was talking about.
When I was at the Georgia Coalition many, like almost 20 years ago, we had brochures that we used grant funding to create brochures in like 6 or 8 different languages and put them in doctors' offices and share them with our member programs throughout the state. And it's so, just to be really explicit and overt about, we are here and we are inclusive and we're welcoming you. That's on us, right? To create that environment. So next slide. Local advocacy, we talked about what issues are survivors facing in your community. And it's important for us to know as service providers, what's happening there in your community for immigrants. Is law enforcement cooperating to sign certifications for U visas? How's ICE operating locally? Are they looking to deport immigrants wherever they can? Etc. Right? These are some examples. So having that awareness and then figuring out who are your allies, and sometimes it may depend on what the particular issue is. You may find that because of a specific issue related to what's going on in the labor arena, you may be hearing from a lot of immigrant survivors who are in domestic work kind of jobs. You may end up with close ties to unions in your area, or maybe you've already got them, which is great, right? You may, on a particular issue, want to work really closely with a local racial justice organization, or maybe it's around reproductive justice. Maybe there's a culturally specific organization that serves a particular language or cultural community. There's loads of options, and whatever the issues are, what I would say is that ASISTA, we generally really believe in collaboration. It's actually one of our core values is collaboration. Collaboration's good, partnerships are good. So sort of, thinking outside the box for who can be helpful to you in serving immigrant survivors, even if, and maybe especially if, you need to go outside of the usual suspects, right? Outside of, you're probably in close contact with your local rape crisis center, or your state sexual assault coalition, for instance, which is awesome. But thinking broader than that, where are those points of connection that you can really work together to serve immigrant survivors in your community or in your state. And so if we can go to the next slide. When you've got a handle on what that local landscape looks like for immigrant survivors, you can be a part of creating local solutions, especially if you've got some of those diverse partnerships, right? So at ASISTA, we have this collaborative of state and local organizations who are actively crafting these solutions. We jump on a call and brainstorm that stuff together and network about that. We've got a few examples up here, and I don't know, I think Cecilia, you're a little bit closer to these if you want to just pick out like 1 or 2 and just highlight for us.
Sure. And so a few of these is that several states, including potentially some of yours, have developed state laws on U visa certifications. So for example, oftentimes a person would reach out to a police department or a DA's office for a U visa certification and not really hear back in any kind of consistent time frame. So what some of these laws do is create timeframes in which law enforcement must respond to a request for U visa certifications. So a lot of times that's 90 days. If a person is in immigration court or has an issue where they might age out of protection, that's 2 weeks. And so all these states kind of differ with regard to kind of facilitating the process to obtain new visa certifications. Some other things that have been done, I think, which is really, really exciting, especially kind of the policies of Washtenawa County, Michigan, is creating really robust certification policies, is kind of understanding and incorporating the fact that someone's own criminal history, how that should or should not factor into their decision to issue a U visa certification. Because again, law enforcement is not the decider. They're not handing out visas. So your local DA's office or police offices is not like, okay, a visa for you. That is a decision made by the Immigration Service, right? So I think policies like this, and it's because there is such partnerships with the DA's office and organizations to recognize kind of that having robust policies kind of creates greater community engagement and trust. Has some really, I think, incredible work has been done on the local level. And so if you're in a state and you have a question about what's going on, we're happy to plug you into that. Because again, as Kirsten said, we are huge believers in collaboration. We as many shoulders to the door as possible, moving things forward. So if you're interested in this, please reach out to us and we can kind of connect you to folks locally or in your state who are working on these issues.
Absolutely. And sometimes your voice is the exact voice that would be so helpful at the table, right? So please do think about that. And if we can go to the next slide, on a very related note, we want to tell you about the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. Some of you may already be hooked in with this group. If not, I want to just invite you to join us. This is an organization made up of folks like you that we co-chair with these three other organizations you see here. The Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Esperanza United is the new name for Casa de Esperanza, and the Tahereh Justice Center. We also co-chair with them the Immigration Subcommittee of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. So it serves both of those functions. And if we go to the next slide, we can tell you a little bit about what we do in that group. You can see up here on the slide, it is a network of advocates, again, like you, service providers, organizations, and allies. And it's about taking action on policies specifically that impact immigrant survivors of violence. And so the expertise that you bring being part of this field is a really critical voice in the policy process. And we're wanting to harness that sort of collective knowledge to build collective power around that. So we're providing tools and resources to stakeholders, analyzing the impact of immigration related policies. What do those policies mean for survivors? And you saw some of that in action with Cecilia earlier on this webinar, looking at when those policies happen, what does it mean for survivors, right? That's who we're really looking out for here and interested in supporting. And at the same time, using communication strategies to positively influence the public narrative around survivors. So we know what that narrative around immigration has looked like, particularly in recent years. And again, trying to use what we know about the realities of immigrant survivors' lives to help shape that conversation, bringing that immigration lens into survivor space and survivor lens into immigration space is a really great group. And so just really encourage you to join us. So if we can jump to the next slide, that's how you get on our mailing list for AIS, and encourage you to check out AIS. And also here's our contact info for Asista as well. Encourage you to check that out and join us. And we tried very hard to leave a little bit of time for questions that haven't gotten answered so far or that have come up for you in the presentation. And so I think if you're good with that, Cecilia, I think we can open it up now for a few questions if that works for our NCADV friends too.
Absolutely. Please feel free.
All right.
I see one, Cecilia, when you were talking about the different types, I think it was orders, earlier. Can you briefly explain the difference between the two?
Absolutely, I'm glad to. And I did put a link into the National Immigrant Law Centers. So a judicial warrant is kind of is a document that authorizes law enforcement to enter into a particular area, like a premise, right? So that's a home or workplace. And so it's issued by a court saying that there's permission to come in here. And so then I'm going to see if I can put in a sample of an ICE warrant. An ICE warrant is just basically a piece of paper from ICE, right? That says that they're there to make an arrest or a seizure. And that does not authorize you to come into your home or another premises. And so that's why when we're talking about agency awareness is to kind of understand, what literally gets you in the door and what doesn't. Right, is to kind of have an understanding about immigration enforcement. If they call your agency, it's the same thing as if law enforcement calls your organization, right? What policies do you have around information to make sure that everyone knows that this is protected? You can't confirm or deny a person is a client. And so it's just basically kind of thinking about those conversations around confidentiality and about your spaces, and how immigration kind of folds into that. And so there's lots of different resources. ACLU has a lot of great things, which is talking about enforcement actions in an individual's home or workplace or car. And there's also something that the Immigrant Legal Resource Center has, with these red cards. I don't know if you've seen them, which is kind of saying, these are my rights. And so to the extent that you have an interest in sharing your rights materials around immigration, I'm happy to connect you with those as well.
Fabulous. So to echo Andrea's point, this really has just been a fantastic training. And I agree, it wasn't long enough. Regardless, I just wanted to say, I personally have learned a lot, and I just want to learn more. So it's fantastic.
And Andrea, I feel the weight of that on you. I feel that weight that you're carrying in your comment. I'm the one and only resource, and it's a really heavy place to be in. So we want to, join us. We want to hook you in, connect you with resources and everything we can do, so this feels less like a solo effort and take some of that weight off. So you've got collaborators and partners. We always want to help support that.
Right. And I think the thing that we work with attorneys and advocates just like you across the country, and really try to create spaces for a community in terms of listservs or other opportunities for us to strategize together on local and state policy. And so we're really, we mean it when we say that we want you to be a part of the conversation, because we absolutely do. Because I think what Kirsten said is really important. Oftentimes in these spaces, when we're talking about immigration related advocacy, your voices bring such a unique and significant impact to those conversations, because who around those tables are talking about that, or who work with it every day, right? And so I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and actually just adding on to that, I want to say that this immigration space can feel so daunting, right? The law is very complex. It is constantly changing. It's tough for immigration attorneys to keep up. There is a lot. And I say that because I don't want it to feel like a barrier for you to engage on this issue. We're all always learning. So the value of what you know about what's happening in your community, how to serve survivors, what survivors are experiencing, is so clutch, so important. So if you're feeling like, oh, I don't know if I can speak up or jump in because I don't know, I haven't memorized all the differences between the U visa and the VAWA self-petition, join us. I mean, we're all on a journey, and I don't want that to be a barrier for your participation, because we're all learning. So just start where you are and get on board.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, it seems like, the audience doesn't have any more questions. I cannot thank you enough for this amazing presentation. But want to remind attendees that we will be sending you all the information that was included in today's webinar, including a recording of this webinar, a link to a certificate of participation, the PowerPoint, and then of course, Cecilia and Kirsten, I'll connect with you about any other resources that you wish to share with registrants and attendees. But I think we'll just go ahead and end this session now. I can't thank you enough. And separately, I'll be following up with two of you on a couple of different issues. But to everyone who attended today, thank you so much. Reach out to us if there's anything that we at NCADV can do. And again, look for that email that will land in your inbox in another few days. So take good care. Cecilia, Kirsten, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and thanks
Thank
y'all
you so much for having us. Thank
you,
you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.